Nowadays, given the fact that the global United Nations Conference on Climate Change will start in Paris in less than 1 week from now. The city of Paris was in recent days very much in the spotlight of the political and media attention, and security aspects will certainly affect also the climate conference and the side events. Hopefully, these aspects will not overshadow climate change challenges, because the stakes are high, and as we heard in the previous panel, the time is running fast. I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion on this issue today. Let me now introduce our distinguished guests. I will start with the lady, my colleague from the European Commission, Mrs. Mary Veronica Tovšak Pleterski, who is the Director for European and International Carbon Markets at the Directorate General for Climate Action at the European Commission. Mr. Thomas Meister, who is Director for Climate and Environmental Policy at the Federal Forest Office in Berlin. Mr. Norbert Kurila, Director General at the Ministry of Environment of the Slovak Republic. Mr. Raffia Balian, who is the Director of the US Department of the State Regional Environment, Science, Technology and Health Hub Office in Budapest. Mr. Yuan, Director at the Project Development Office of the International Green Economic Association in Beijing. Mr. Miroslav Kiraľvarga, Vice President for External Affairs, Administration and Business Development at US Steel Košice. And last but not least, Mr. Thomas Spencer, a Program Director for Climate at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Thomas will start the panel discussion with a short introduction explaining what is the climate conference about, why it takes place, what are the main objectives, and what are maybe the possible outcomes from the point of view of the organizing country. Please, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be on this panel with such a distinguished body of speakers. So, yeah, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. Let me start by briefly presenting myself and the institution for which I work. So, my name is Thomas Spencer. I have been working on climate change and energy issues for almost 10 years. I have a background in international law of climate change and in energy economics, and experience working on both the international negotiations of climate change, but also energy policy in France and at the European Union level. The institution for which I work is a research think tank, not-for-profit, independent, based at the University of s.r.o. And we've been working for 15 years on sustainable development issues, on energy policy, and on the international negotiations of climate change. We have been very involved in the preparations for COP21 for the last 3 years. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, to advise him and his team. And my former boss, Laurence Tubiana, who founded the institution for which I work, is the special envoy for climate change to the Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius. So we have been very deeply involved in the preparations for COP21. I would like to start my brief talk by giving an overview of what the objectives for COP21 are. Then I would like to make a few remarks regarding the perspectives for COP21, what the big issues are, what the chances of success are, and what the next steps will be for international diplomacy on climate change. So let me start with the objectives for COP21. The first crucial objective is to negotiate a universal agreement. And by this we mean several things. The Kyoto Protocol was a universal agreement. All countries ratified it apart from the United States, but it didn't contain obligations on developing countries to act, and as I mentioned, the United States didn't ratify. So here when we say a universal agreement, we mean an agreement in which all countries are required to take action. I think the fact that we already have 161 countries having pledged their emission reduction contributions, covering almost 90% of global GDP and global emissions, is a very good sign for the fact that we are indeed heading for an agreement which divide between developed countries on the one hand and developing countries on the other hand. We know that times have changed since we negotiated the UNFCCC Convention on Climate Change. Countries like China have gone through very important phases of economic development, and there is a lot of diversity already within the group of developing countries. So the objective is to have a universal agreement which much better reflects the really broad range. The negotiations in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Summit resulted indeed in a universal climate agreement in which all major economies took voluntary action on climate change, and this included countries like India and China, by the way. But as I said, this action was voluntary, and it was done in the framework of a non-legally binding agreement. Here the objective is to have a legally binding agreement. By this we mean an international agreement that would be ratifiable under domestic procedures. This agreement should contain binding mechanisms to ensure the transparency of what countries have proposed to do, but may not necessarily contain legal obligations to achieve exactly the contributions for emissions reduction that countries have put forward. It will contain, we hope, a binding obligation for countries to undertake serious measures to implement their obligations, but they will not be sanctioned if they don't achieve them 100%. We are aiming indeed for the United States, for example, to ratify this agreement, and there are legal ways that this can be done. And in this way we can have a binding international agreement that the United States can participate in. The third criteria for the agreement is that it should be ambitious. The international community has set the objective of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. We saw some very interesting presentations this morning about where the emission reduction contributions bring us relative to this target. So already we have a significant amount of progress embodied in these contributions, but they don't bring us to 2 degrees. So the Paris Agreement should enshrine a principle by which every country is required to come back to the table at a regular interval. Many countries are talking about 5 years, every 5 years, coming back to the table in order to propose new emission reduction contributions and to increase the level of ambition. And in this way we would have a long-term objective, the 2 degrees, and a commitment to work continuously, predictably towards that target. This could mean that we would be already back at the negotiation table by 2020, being asked to present new emission reduction targets. So what is the perspective for success in Paris? I would say that in these 2 years of negotiations there has been an incredible level of political work between the major players, which has led to quite a high degree of understanding about what we are trying to achieve in Paris. So let me give you some examples. The United States and China have signed 2 declarations at head of state level, which outline both domestic policy commitments, but also the key elements of what they would like to see in the Paris Agreement. Likewise, France and China have signed a head of state level declaration, which contains the key elements that they would like to see in the Paris Agreement. And when you take a look at all this political work that we have done, I think there is a high level of convergence, much higher than was the case before the Copenhagen Summit. As was highlighted this morning, we already have emission reduction contributions from 161 countries. They show very positive signs in terms of promoting renewables, in terms of promoting energy efficiency, and ultimately in terms of reducing emissions. So that is a very positive step. And these contributions are essentially the key bricks for the agreement. and they increase the likelihood that we will have an agreement. You don't go through the very difficult domestic process of developing a contribution like we did here in Europe without being confident that this would be reflected in an international agreement later on. There are obviously several difficult issues still outstanding, and I would highlight the issue of finance as being a crucial one. We will have to find a way to respect the goal that we set ourselves in Copenhagen of mobilizing $100 billion US. Another key issue is this issue of what we call in the technical jargon of the negotiations differentiation. In other words, how do we make sure that we can have a legal agreement that is universal and fully respects countries' diversity, but does not put them into this black and white distinction between developed and developing countries? That is a big challenge. We also have a challenge just by the fact that we only have 2 weeks left of negotiations, and time is really short. And so just from a procedural perspective, it will be very tough to get agreement. So let me close with some perspectives. I think the chances are high that in Paris we will have an agreement that reflects the 3 key criteria that I set out at the start, namely a universal binding agreement that sets long-term ambitions and establishes credible procedures to work towards those long-term goals. The crucial thing for me is that we shift to immediately implement the agreement, and in fact many countries are already adopting policies to implement their emission reduction contributions, and so we in Europe have an important task next year to implement. It will be an agreement that will have to be strengthened, and I think one of the key differences with the Kyoto Protocol and with the Copenhagen agreements is that this time we have set ourselves the task of defining an agreement that can be dynamic, that will be strengthened over time. So this is by no means the end of the story. So let me close there. I would also like to say that despite the events in Paris last Friday, there will be a big political mobilization. Many heads of state, almost 140, are committed to come. The COP will go ahead as was planned, and I think with this level of political commitment, the chances are good that we will find an agreement. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion and any questions.
Many thanks, Thomas, for your very comprehensive overview. Mrs. Tovšak, Pleterski, the EU economy is currently the most carbon-efficient major economy in the world. It has been also particularly successful in decoupling economic growth and the greenhouse gas emission. It has put in place ambitious policies on renewables and energy efficiency. Decarbonization also features prominently in many European policies. So what are the EU expectations from the Paris conference and from the global deal?
Well, first of all, let me thank also from my side for organizing this panel discussion today on this very important topic. And surely it is very timely to look from closer perspective what is in the Paris for Europe and how we are going to achieve this ambitious universal and legally binding agreement in just a few weeks from now. So I would like to maybe start, or rather stressing the same point that Thomas was explaining so well at the beginning, that it is very encouraging that at this time we have such an unprecedented global effort to demonstrate the willingness to tackle climate change. As Thomas mentioned, we have now 165 countries that put together national pledges how to mobilize domestic action to fight this phenomenon. I would like to insist that this is a very, very important element at the starting point of the discussions in Paris. As you would remember, in the second Kyoto Protocol, there were many less countries that took this action. It was 35 countries that were committed to action. Now we have a phenomena going from action by few to action by all. And yes, indeed, Livia, as you said, the European Union has taken a leadership on this. With our ambitious targets, we have created markets for climate-friendly technologies and products. And with our climate diplomacy, I believe, we ensured our partners are engaged. So our international cooperation is not only driving the climate action in the developing world, but also helping this process, helping these negotiations. As Thomas mentioned, we expect that financial support will find itself in the heart of discussions in Paris. But I just want to stress from the outset also that there is already a constant action since Copenhagen, where there was a pledge to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate action in developing countries. And the European Union is taking its part in it and is contributing very importantly to also deliver on that promise. Now, with all these important positive developments, and as I said, unprecedented actions that were taken by so many countries around the globe, we still know when analyzing these climate pledges, we call them INDCs, which is very technical language, but basically national pledge for reducing carbon emissions. With all these pledges, we are still not reaching where we would like to be, the objective of below 2 degrees Celsius. So that brings me to stress yet another point, how important it is that we have an agreement for the future which is dynamic and capable of keeping us on track to eventually come on track for that 2 degrees objective. Now, with this short introduction, I would like to dive into Paris Agreement and picture a little bit what are the key asks from the European Union position and how we hope that will be addressed. So first of all, I would say that the building blocks discussed in the negotiating agreements would be, well, the major ones would include climate mitigation, which in simple words means emission reduction, then adaptation to climate change impacts, and financial and other support to countries that need that support. Then we have cross-cutting challenges related to all of these three components. These are differentiation, as Thomas already explained it, I can be short on this, so how countries are going to divide the obligation, and then also the legal form and force of different commitments. So these two issues, differentiation and legal form and force, are of the cross-cutting nature. So if I'm asked to say the three key priorities of the European Union for an agreement to be global, I would maybe concentrate on the following 3 points. First, the long-term goal. Secondly, dynamic review and progression on mitigation. And thirdly, robust transparency and accountability regime. So I'll try to explain this in a bit more simpler words, perhaps, and what do we mean by these three important objectives. Well, a global vision for a long-term goal is very important. It is important because this is a signal for broader audiences, from businesses, for investors, a signal of governments that they are determined to transition to low-carbon economy. The agreement, in our view, will confirm the objective to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, but the European Union wishes to translate this goal to a more concrete and operational language in the agreement that will be consistent with the latest scientific evidence. What do I mean by that? The European Union would like to have language reflected that would say that we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050 below 1990 levels. So this is much more concrete than only the general objectives of 2 degrees. And then also to say that we should be near to zero emissions or below by 2100. So this is in terms of the long-term goal. Now, regarding the mechanism to regulatory review or regular review and raise of the ambition level, I would like to stress that it is very important that we collectively know whether we are on track to achieve the long-term goal and how we are going to strengthen, as I said at the beginning, that will be needed, how we are going to strengthen the parties' emissions reduction target throughout time. So we are also one of those, as Thomas mentioned, that would see a very important element that every 5 years we have a stock-taking or review of the progress made. My third point relates to robust transparency and accountability regime. Why this is important? It is important because parties need to be able to trust that what was promised will be delivered and that reductions achieved are accounted for consistently in all parties of the agreement. To be credible, national pledges must be backed by binding multilateral agreed rules on transparency and accountability. We do believe that rules are essential to ensure environmental integrity and to hold parties accountable for delivering on their mitigation commitments. So if I would like to be sure, I would say these are 3 key asks from the European Union. But very closely linked to this, I would like to share with you also the European Union position on the cross-cutting issues, as I mentioned 2 of them at least, differentiation and legal form and legal force. The UNFCCC division into developed and developing countries, as mentioned by Thomas, with most obligation on developed countries, does clearly not reflect today a reality anymore. This comes from 1990s, where the world was quite different and the economic weight of different parties was different compared to today's reality. So what do we want here is that the Paris Agreement has to reflect more contemporary division of responsibilities in terms of obligation of parties to the agreement. While we know that the most advanced economies, such as the EU, will continue to play the leading role, all parties need to play their part. And this is really a very critical element for the future agreement, I believe, that will be reflected in different components of the agreement. Now, in terms of legal form and legal force, I would like to say the following. Having an emission reduction target must be a precondition to become a party to the Paris Agreement. So we think this is very important element, that you have an emission reduction target, and the agreement needs to be robust and legally binding, and provide a robust legal framework for tracking and promoting parties' performance of their targets. In relation to the climate financing, which is going to play a critical role in the Paris Agreement, it is expected that climate financing and support will be, as I said, important element, but in line with evolving capabilities. Parties that are in a position to provide the enhanced financial and technical assistance and capacity building to support poor and vulnerable countries are expected to do so. And implement these commitments under the agreement. For pre-2020, the focus will be on building trust and showing results on this $100 billion commitment. Post-2020 challenges will be responding to the calls for a quantified goal and making sure that this firewall between developed and developing countries is not the basis of participation in the effort. There are, of course, other important elements that will be part of the agreement. I'm sure we are going to address them in the panel, but I would like to stop here and just maybe say by concluding that the Paris Agreement should not be only a sprint, but it should be a start of the marathon to global decarbonization. I don't think Paris will be a final solution by itself, but it will be certainly catalyzer, the start of a new chapter in the fight against climate change. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now I have two panelists from various EU member states, a German one and a Slovak one. I would like to start with the German, Mr. Meister. How do you see the negotiations? What is the German position? How does it differ maybe from the European Commission or from the position of other member states?
Thank you for the introduction, Livia. I must say, after these two excellent presentations are hard acts to follow by Mary and Thomas. The only disappointment for me being that I sometimes love to argue and to disagree, and there's practically nothing I should disagree with, so I try my best to put a different perspective from Germany on it, but basically I think we have the same opinion on practically every other issue that you've addressed so far. Ladies and gentlemen, last month in Bonn there was a negotiations by the ADP group in order to prepare for Paris, and our impression was that our climate action is very busy, but still sometimes you realize that it cannot keep up with the real world impacts of global warming, because, for example, at that time we were painfully reminded of the urgency of an ambitious agreement by reports of Hurricane Patricia, which was about to hit the Mexican coastline with unprecedented strength. And believe it or not, climate change has also arrived in Germany by extreme weather events, of course, on a much lower scale. My home state, North Rhine-Westphalia, was hit last year by two devastating storms, crippling towns and cities for a couple of days. Düsseldorf suffered, the Ruhr suffered, and in Germany those events also have become more frequent. Now we do notice that just a few days before Paris, climate negotiations will take off. There's a substantial tension within governments, media and the public, and the expectations are running high. We asked ourselves the questions whether Paris can deliver what we failed to achieve 6 years ago, and I think you already answered this question brilliantly, and we are also convinced that the only answer to this question is a firm and a solid yes. Obviously, we've been at the same time, we have to curb our expectations in the sense of a realistic approach, because we will not arrive at an agreement that will instantaneously halt climate change, because global realities are far too complex. But what we do want is indeed, as was mentioned before, to limit global warming below the 2 degrees Celsius mark. For this, we need an agreement in which countries, developed, developing, and emerging economies make a commitment according to their capabilities. Richer countries must help those which are financially weaker, and our long-term goal is a world without fossil energy sources. In the EU, it was agreed, as was also mentioned before, to reduce CO2 by at least 40% in 2030 and 80 to 95% by 2050. Germany is aiming to be at the upper end of this range. And I'm convinced that restricting climate change is also a prerequisite, we haven't mentioned that before, for combating poverty, hunger, war, and the movement of refugees. Let me just quote Pope Francis in this context. He made it impressively clear in his encyclical recently. He wrote, quote, We are not faced with two separate crises, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental, end of quote. And that's precisely the point. Climate action and eliminating poverty go hand in hand. In Paris, and this is a bit of the German perspective, but also I think very much congruent with what Mary and Thomas said so far, we aim at a modern, dynamic, and fair result. Modern for us is that the division in industrialized and developing countries should be overcome, dynamic by further developing flexible ambition mechanisms, and of course it should be fair in the sense that responsibilities and capacities of all countries involved should be taken into account. Countries in need should be supported in adaptation and in mitigation. Germany wants to put the global transformation on a solid basis by concluding a legally binding climate agreement applicable to all parties and with 4 targets. Also, that's very much in the line of what Mary told us before. First of all, the agreement on a long-term goal, translating into below 2 degrees objective in the spirit of decarbonization. And as a matter of fact, decarbonization is a relatively new catchword, and Thomas, I believe, mentioned already the important agreements between France and China and the United States and China, and might add on also the declaration by Brazil, President Dilma Rousseff, and Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel from Germany, was a huge step forward. Secondly, single, strong, and universally binding rules with inbuilt flexibility to ensure maximum transparency, accountability. Thirdly, the nationally determined mitigation commitments and a mechanism for regular revision. And fourthly, the agreement must ensure 2 more things. It must promote climate resilient developments, and Germany takes this very seriously and aims to double its climate finance by 2020 compared to 2014, as was announced by Chancellor Merkel earlier this year at the Petersburg Climate Conference. Just a few words more on financing. Together with the G7, Germany reaffirmed its strong commitment to the target under the Copenhagen Accord of mobilizing the $100 billion per year from 2020 onwards. Further, the G7 will continue their efforts to mobilize increased finance from public and private sources, and to demonstrate that they and others are well on their way to meet the 100 billion target, and stand ready to engage proactively in the negotiations of finance provisions of the Paris outcome. Finally, again, to agree what has been said before, why are we so optimistic on the prospects for Paris? Indeed, unlike in Copenhagen 6 years ago, we now have 196 parties committed to the principle of multilateral processes. Over 160 countries have submitted their INDCs, and there already is a chance to reduce global warming. In Potsdam, near Berlin, we have the Potsdam Climate Institute, and they some time ago introduced an instrument which is called the Carbon Tracker, and they are capable of measuring the impact of mitigation, and they checked out that the current INDCs that we have so far might already reduce global warming from close to 4 degrees to just 2.7 degrees if all these INDCs were to materialize. Yet the INDCs submitted so far will thus not suffice for reaching the 2 degrees target. So what we need to achieve in Paris is therefore a review mechanism that allows us to reassess our ambitions on a regular basis. Dissent is still present when it comes to the question of which legal form national mitigation contributions should have. Germany and the EU would like to see those as national goals, which should be determined as multilaterally binding within the Paris Agreement. Other parties in the negotiations see this part of the agreement on the national level. At the same time, and just to conclude, it is clear that international climate financing will not suffice in bringing about the necessary framework for global transformation. Therefore, every country will have to make its own contribution according to its capabilities and responsibilities to divert investments towards a sustainable path. Divestment seems to be the order of the day, and is quite impressive what some companies already committed in that direction, diverting their investments from, say, brown energy towards green energy, and this can also be a major contribution to protecting the climate. Germany and the EU have a special responsibility in this context. Other industrialized countries like the US, emerging economies like China, as well as developing countries like Morocco, are closely observing our efforts to arrive at a decarbonized economy. This is nothing less than a Herculean task. We will have to face hardline resistance to be overcome if we want an ambitious agreement to protect our climate, but we will do our very best. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Norbert, what about Slovakia? It is certainly not known for being one of the hardest supporters of an ambitious climate policy. So what is the Slovak position compared to the European Commission position or to the German position, and what are maybe the Slovak specificities?
Thank you very much, Livia. Good afternoon to all, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to be here and to speak to this distinguished audience. It was a very good question, although I must admit that many of the things has been already said, and it's really difficult to contribute any further, but I will try to focus on the Slovak way forward. So, as the panelists expressed before me, the main objective for Slovakia is to arrive at a meaningful, universal, comprehensive and legally binding agreement. This is an overarching objective that actually EU and Slovakia is committed to work towards too. And for Slovakia there is maybe three main elements. I guess some of them have been already mentioned. Nevertheless, I would like to say that agreement shall be durable in nature. It cannot be that all the negotiators would meet each and every 5 years and reopen the whole negotiations. I think it should be permanent with, let's say, forward-looking commitments towards 2050. And second issue, all parties to the agreement must have a mitigation commitment. I think this is a key ask. And the agreement, obviously, since we speak about the universality, it must be applicable to all major economies or to all parties possible. Regarding Paris itself, I think we need to make at least two main decisions. One of is this differentiation. We need to stop distincting, parties. I think we have to respect the evolving realities in this matter. And second issue is the financing. I think it's fairly fair to say that those are interlinked, and we should. They cannot actually live with each other. There is a notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, but at the same time there is a notion of respective capabilities. So this is the key notion I wanted to bring it up. We know that the UNFCCC framework is already established since early 90s, and maybe for the Paris it's around time to merge those traditional division between developing and developed countries. In terms of financing, it wasn't mentioned by the panelists before. There's this ultimate figure to arrive by 2020 to 100 billions. I think the world as such is on track, because just for 2014, in 2014, 62 billions were mobilized. So I think there is a big potential that the global community meet its target by 2020, whereas 15 billion were provided by the EU as a whole. So it's just to confirm that the EU plays its leading role, and it shows that the EU and the Slovakia are committed to go ahead with further support. I may mention also some red lines for Slovakia. Even though we negotiated in the blocks, I think there is a national component associated. And for Slovakia at this point of time, raising the pre-2020 emission reduction levels would be problematic. We see the EU pledge minus 40% at least minus 40% against 1990 in relative terms by 2030 as leading by example case. And we don't see at this point of time other actors being at least near to us. So I think this issue of raising pre-2020 ambition would cause some difficulties. And of one also important thing that when we talk about the climate financing, we should be very coherent in all international fora and multilateral processes. I mentioned perhaps the just recently adopted Agenda 2030, which also requires certain financial involvement, and we should see rather synergies than a competition between climate and other financing. Key preconditions, I think it was already mentioned, but I reiterate this because it's important. The new agreement should have a long-term target, which would account for at least minus 50% by 2050, or as EU is pushing of at least 80 to 95% by 2050, and and by 2100 near to zero, so full decarbonization. It has to be dynamic, as was already said. So we need to reflect on new technological breakthrough and adjust the ambition levels, and also this transparency and accountability, because all commitments that are being made must be comparable in one way or the other. Regarding the components of what we are going to hopefully achieve in Paris, I think in terms of the Slovak perspective, we expect a kind of a framework agreement to be adopted. We now work on a very complex text. I think it accounts of more than 55 pages, but it needs to be narrowed down to maybe to something around 20. But still, it is a very workable draft, and the co-chairs are doing a good job in order to arrive at a decent outcome in Paris. An annex to this framework agreement would be those intended nationally determined pledges. So to the main body of the agreement, all the commitments that were put forward will be attached or annexed, and there's a clear ownership of all parties, that no one is imposing something. It's actually the individual countries that are binding themselves to deliver emission reductions. However, it's also fair to say that we are not reaching what science tells us to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. We are between 2.7 and plus. So, but nevertheless, there's a clear ownership of the parties, and that's the most important and promising factor. Third element would be the financing, and we may expect even the further pledges, not only from developed world, but more importantly from new and industrial emerging countries like India, China, Mexico, and others. And fourth element of this agreement could be this multi-stakeholder approach. It's not only the governments, it's not only so the public authorities, but there is many stakeholders around. There is, businesses that are committed to help, and they are committed to act. Civil society, NGOs, and many other stakeholders that are very important in reaching this universal and legally binding agreement. Last but not least, I have mentioned already the notion of new technologies and technological breakthrough. We think that research and development will play a crucial role in this, and it should be moved much more to the center of the negotiations when we speak about the Paris, but also more broadly, and especially also at national level. And this is maybe the case for Slovakia, where we should be more focused on deploying and on being more innovative in terms of bringing up new clean high-tech and climate low-carbon technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to benefit from an excellent geographical coverage that we have in the panel and ask the US and the Chinese speakers representing the biggest global emitters to present their views. Mr. Raffia, Balian, would you like to start?
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be with you today and to be a part of this distinguished panel. I would like to thank the Slovak Foreign Policy Association not only for their invitation, but also for organizing this conference. As mentioned earlier, I serve as director of a regional office that focuses on environmental, science, technology, and health issues in 20 countries in Central and Eastern Europe. This office was established in the late 80s by the US Department of State, and 12 such offices were established around the world to support regional engagement on issues that are transboundary in nature. As the number of severe weather events increases each year, the importance of transboundary cooperation has become critical. Whether we are trying to prevent flooding, mitigate droughts, fight forest fires, or avoid pandemics, we need a collective and collaborative effort to be successful. This year, we are meeting at a critical time in history. In 1 week, over 40,000 participants will meet in Paris to try and tackle one of the most challenging issues of our time. As we prepare for this meeting, we must reflect on the recent tragedies in Paris and elsewhere. Our hearts and minds are with the families and friends of the victims. We stand resolute that our democratic values will never fall victim to those who seek to destroy progress. 2 weeks ago, Secretary Kerry delivered a speech at Old Dominion University in my home state of Virginia, where he stated that climate change is not only an environmental challenge, but also a threat to security and stability of countries everywhere. He made it clear that this is a security issue and not just an environmental issue. Both President Obama and the Secretary have spoken about what is at stake in Paris. We are negotiating not just an agreement, but more so, we are seeking commitments by countries to transition to low emissions and climate-resilient economies. We support increasing ambition toward a long-term 2 degrees Celsius goal that puts us on path to decarbonize the global economy over the course of this century. A number of countries around the world have already made the commitment to transform their economies to promote resource efficiency, energy diversification, environmental stewardship, innovative clean technologies, and shared prosperity through a sustainable development model. Those countries will be the leaders in the 21st century global marketplace. The United States is ready to work together with all countries to make Paris a success. Through bilateral meetings with China, Brazil, Indonesia, India, and other major emitters, President Obama and his counterparts have announced commitments to taking significant actions to address climate change. We are very encouraged by the fact that to date, over 165 countries have submitted their intended nationally determined contributions to mitigate their emissions as part of a post-2020 regime. Reaching an agreement will not be easy, but it would be a historic step. Therefore, it will be critical that delegations come to Paris not just to repeat their positions, but to find common ground by respecting the concerns and imperatives of others and by being creative and flexible in finding solutions. The United States seeks an ambitious and durable agreement that applies to all countries, is fair and flexible in terms of its legal characteristics to allow all countries to participate, focuses both on reducing emissions and building resilience, includes strong accountability measures, and ensures ongoing financial and technical assistance to those in need. The United States is not waiting for an agreement to take action at home. Under President Obama, we are taking significant steps to stop carbon pollution from major sources. As part of the Climate Action Plan, the administration is finalizing the Clean Power Plan that will reduce U.S. emissions from power plants 32% below 2005 levels by 2030. Since 2009, energy from wind has tripled, and solar has increased 20-fold in the United States. We continue to support the development of a sustainable bio-based economy. We have increased fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks from 27 to 54 miles per gallon, and are now working on medium and heavy truck regulations. Since he took office, President Obama has invested over $90 billion to improve efficiency for buildings and appliances and to invest in renewable energy projects across the United States. The United States is taking action not just at the federal level. 37 U.S. states have renewable energy action plans. Over a dozen major U.S. cities are part of the C40 initiative, led by former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, led by New York and the New England states, is designing a cap-and-trade program for GHG emissions from major power plants. We believe that engagement by non-state actors at the subnational level and within the private sector and civil society will be critical to the global transformation that we seek. The United States is on track to meet our goal of reducing emissions in the range of 17% below 2005 levels in 2020. In our INDC, we set an ambitious new mitigation target to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below the 2005 levels in 2025. This target doubles the pace of U.S. carbon pollution reduction and puts us on a path consistent with achieving deep economy-wide reductions of approximately 80% by 2050, the level that the IPCC has said is in line with science. Our ambitious domestic actions have been matched by our vigorous international engagement. I already mentioned the bilateral efforts with China, India, and others. In addition, we have been working multilaterally to amend the Montreal Protocol to reduce hydrofluorocarbons. We established the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to reduce short-lived climate pollutants, such as methane, and to date have 103 partners supporting the effort. In order to meet the 2-degree target, we must take action on short-lived climate pollutants as we reduce CO2 emissions and decarbonize our economies. The United States has also been a leader in the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative, which seeks to provide energy access to 1.3 billion people living in energy poverty, to double the level of renewable energy in the total global energy mix by 2030, and to increase the rate of energy efficiency improvements. I had the honor of leading, on behalf of the United States, the first Sustainable Energy for All mission in Africa to Ghana. We had representatives from 11 partner governments and organizations join us on that mission. As a result of our efforts in this initiative, the United States launched innovative and collaborative programs such as Power Africa and the U.S.-Africa Clean Energy Finance Initiative. In this region, the United States is very active in promoting energy efficiency, particularly at the municipal level in Ukraine. We have also pledged $3 billion to the new Global Green Climate Fund. An OECD report released in October announced, as Norbert indicated, that in 2014, over $62 billion in climate finance was mobilized. We are well on the way to meet the global goal to mobilize $100 billion of funding from public and private sources by 2020 to support mitigation and transparency efforts by developing countries. In 2009, President Obama proposed under the G20 umbrella to remove fossil fuel subsidies to encourage technology and resource neutrality in energy markets. According to the IEA, as was mentioned earlier today, in 2014, the consumption of fossil fuels was subsidized by over $500 billion globally. This level of support is more than 4 to 5 times the level of subsidies that renewable energy resources receive in the same period. As innovation in clean technologies makes significant advances, the financial pressure on governments that continue to subsidize fossil fuels will increase. With this in mind, I would like to leave you with the words of a former Minister of Oil for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. In a June 2000 interview with The Telegraph, he stated, 30 years from now, there will be a huge amount of oil and no buyers. Oil will be left in the ground. The Stone Age came to an end not because we had a lack of stones, and the oil age will come to an end not because we have a lack of oil. Ladies and gentlemen, the remarkable aspect of this statement is not the prediction, but the fact that it was made at all, and the person who made it. It is clear we are on the cusp of a global economic transformation, and the countries that embrace the possibilities of this new reality will help prepare their citizens to compete in the new marketplace. Those that do not will be left behind. The countries of the Visegrad Group have tremendous potential to succeed in this new reality. Whether they meet their potential will be determined by the political will of their leaders and citizens to shift their economies towards a sustainable development future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspirational speech. Now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Tao Yuan to hear the Chinese view and expectations from the conference.
Dear guests, good afternoon. I'm Tao Yuan from IGEA, the International Green Economy Association, which is based in Beijing, China. I'm very honored to witness such a historic event for Slovakia. Climate change has never been a major issue in Slovakia, yet Slovakia is one of the countries that care most about the environment. Today, I will share some information about China's point of view of COP21, also energy cooperation between Central Eastern European countries and China. Firstly, you will have the brief presentation of IGEA. Secondly, from the China's point of view, the expectation of COP21 and the challenges of COP21. Third, I would like to briefly introduce Chinese economy through a 1-minute video. Fourth, it will be the cooperation opportunities between CEE and China. Let me briefly introduce the IGEA. IGEA is a non-governmental organization with a mission to promote the sustainable development. We have more than 1,000 members and with a green think tank with more than 500 Chinese experts, and we have 150 office workers. But we are not we are not the biggest one in China. We have hundreds of the no-governmental association who is promoting the sustainable development. We have several areas of expertise. We mainly focus on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and green buildings, and so on. IGEA has successfully involved many renewable power plants in China, such as photovoltaic power plant and biomass power plant. Then let me briefly introduce IGEA honorary chairman. His name is s.r.o. Kang. He was the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. He also is the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference of Sustainable Development, which is also with the name Rio Plus 20. We do care about the climate change as much as our chairman does. Okay. And you can see from this Mr. Xie Zhenhua, he's special representative of the climate change negotiation. And he said, I can't see, but China wants the upcoming COP can make a very successful agreement. Also, he points out about the same goal but different responsibility. Like China is the biggest one with the CO2 emission, but China is still developing country. So I think how to balance the developed and the developing countries' responsibility will be the key point of this. And unfortunately, 2012, I think 12 November of 2014, China intended to achieve the peaking of CO2 emission around 2013, and to make the best effort to peaking early, and also intend to increase the share of the no fossil fuels in primary energy consumer and to around 20 by 2030. I think you guys may never went to China, but from my side, I think it's a very big step for China. I prepared one small video for China's economy, but I think it's not going to play. I'm not an expert for the economy, but I was going to share a video of China's economy. But I like to do the next one is about the cooperation opportunities between CEE and China. I know this panel is about the climate change, and but the conference is a Central Eastern Energy Conference, so I'd like to share some of the energy cooperation opportunities. So you see the picture, you may say, it's a reminder you about the old Silk Road. That brought the green tea, the silk from China to Europe. China, from 35 years development, China has become a very powerful country. And China is seeking the international cooperation opportunities. And our leader, Xi Jinping, has promoted a One Belt and One Road strategy. So, see the red one is the One Road. It's from the center of China until to the west of the Europe. And the blue one is the One Belt. The Southeast Asia, India, or the Middle East will be involved too. So we focus on the building a facility, which is transportation, energy, and communication. From my knowledge, I have seen many of the Chinese companies has successfully cooperation in Eastern Europe countries like the energy facility building. So you may wonder, from China's very powerful studies, why can't China take more responsibility over the climate change? Because China's economy looks very good, but its development model has needs improvement. The industry structure needs a better balance. China still have a lot of the heavy industries such as cement, glass, steel, coal, which still have a very huge share of China GDP. Finally, I would like to say I'm not from the government organization. I'm from the non-government organization. There's hundreds and thousands of non-government associations like us working to promote against the climate change. I believe, from my opinion, I think if China is not heavily limited, China is willing to take the leadership of the developing countries against the climate exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The only panelist who has not spoken yet is Mr. Kiraľvarga from US Steel, and he's also the only industry representative in the panel. So I hope that you will tell us more about the implications of the climate agreement or of an absence of the climate agreement on the Slovak and European industry. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Livia. The distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so pleased that at 4:45 almost, so many of you are still here, and hopefully you are ready to listen to me a little bit. I have plenty of material which has been prepared by my colleague for me, and I am just deleting, since all my colleagues mention almost everything. But on the other hand, I think that I have some interesting information to share with you, as Livia mentioned, from industry point of view and how we see the COP21 coming and what we see would be the most important for business and industry of Europe and European Union. So let me see that it is crucial that COP21 in Paris agrees on legally binding and global agreement with comparable mitigation efforts from major economies. It was several times mentioned, legally binding. A truly level playing field would be the best solution to provide the necessary certainty for business investments and to stimulate investment and provide opportunities for companies in the research, development and deployment of existing and new technologies. Such a multilateral agreement will also help to drive the competitiveness of European industry, supporting global emission reductions in an efficient manner. We have to ensure effective protection for EU companies against carbon leakage risks and for non-EU industrial competitors operate under comparable climate protection rules. This will allow a level playing field for European businesses competing globally and promote economic growth. Business is key for successful and ambitious agreement in Paris and in its implementation. Therefore, an institutional channel for business engagement should be recognized in the implementation of the new agreement. Business Europe, the largest employers association in the EU we are part of, has devised 10 recommendations, as you can see on the next slide, to feed into the international climate negotiation towards COP21. If implemented, this set of recommendations will achieve adequate global climate protection as well as enable a true level playing field for European industry. Let me walk you just through the most important ones. First, establish a shared vision for long-term global action to combat climate change. European companies have helped the EU become the most emissions-efficient economy in the world. It achieved a 19% emission reduction between 1990 and now, while its GDP grew by 45%. Let's see the next slide, which is from 2013, so you can see the only countries with a green and the others are increasing their emissions over 1990. Currently, the EU only accounts for 9% of global emissions, and this share is still falling while China is responsible for a quarter of the global emission. Again, this pipe on the slide you can see is from 2011, so it's still visible EU 10%, but even 10% or 9%, we are talking about target. Let's assume the target for EU to go to zero should be 100% now, but that would be the target 10% for the rest of the world, and we can achieve the same goal for the globe that we can achieve for Europe only, or with Europe only. This means we need commitment from all world's major economies. Countries with the highest responsibilities and capabilities needs to reflect this in the ambition of their commitments. In addition, the new agreement should have as much geographical coverage as possible. This would bring obvious benefits not only to the global climate but also for business trading globally by being subject to similar standards. A global, legally binding climate regime post-2020. All major economies must sign up to a legally binding agreement under the United Nations regime containing transparent, comparable, fair, and ambitious emissions reduction commitments. All countries will benefit from an agreement with such a legally binding nature. The next one which I wanted to mention is emission reduction efforts from emerging companies and economies. Given the urgency of the problem, all countries need to act urgently and collectively. As it was mentioned, since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the geo-economic landscape of the world has changed. While some emerging economies still face challenges, their capabilities have also evolved. The last one which I wanted to mention is incentivize the creation of the linkable carbon markets. Policymakers should make every effort to ensure that carbon markets are attractive for all participants and become compatible and linkable. Comparable framework conditions will encourage business to continue and to increase their investments in research, development, and new technologies. Equally important to us, to business, to European industry, is what will happen if Paris does not deliver a global deal. Well, that's a pragmatic approach from the business side. Until a global level playing field is reality, the EU has to urgently address the problem of carbon leakage. Industrial competitiveness must be mainstream throughout all European policies, thus contributing to the transformation into a highly competitive, resource-efficient and low-carbon economy in Europe. This requires foremost a structural reform of the EU trading scheme. As long as there are no comparable efforts undertaken in other major economies, Implementation of 2030 framework should be in line with the need to preserve the competitiveness of the EU industry. This requires more careful and realistic, technically and economically achievable definition of the benchmarks based on real production levels and deletion of the cross-sectorial reduction factor to ensure 100% free allocation at the level of the most efficient European installations in sectors at risk of carbon leakage. It is equally important to fully offset the CO2 cost passed through by the power sector on these sectors at the level of the most electricity efficient EU installations. For the indirect compensation, a harmonized EU-wide frame is needed to avoid distortion of the competition within the EU. We support the objective to ensure the EU as global leader in renewable energy, but the measures to achieve this have to respect competition and market rules, be market-driven, and avoid increasing end-user prices of energy. The EU, therefore, shall examine the different national practices regarding the tax and network fees components of the cost of energy. Innovation support must be extended to industrial sectors. The revenues from auctioning should be reinvested for low-carbon technology support as foreseen in the ETS directive or energy efficiency, but more importantly, they should be used by member states to stimulate economic growth and relevant R&D investments. To sum up, we share the EU's ambition to effectively combat climate change while at the same time delivering on its objective for jobs, growth, and competitiveness. We are not an enemy of EU's environmental policies and climate objectives, but rather just the opposite. We are part of the global solution on how to tackle the climate change. Steel is the foundation of Europe's economy, and its major value chains, such as automotive, construction, mechanical engineering, domestic appliances, as well as low-carbon energy sources. It is therefore indispensable to Europe's skill base, innovation, resource efficiency, environmental protection, employment, and growth. It is essential that steel is made in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kiraľvarga, for the business view in the panel. Now we heard all the presentations. Many thanks to all the panelists. Would you like to react on some of the presentations, in particular the speakers that have spoken first? No, it's not the case. So we now have over 30 minutes for questions from the audience. I count on your questions. Please be ready. I would like to benefit from my position as a moderator and ask the first two questions on all the panelists. We have heard from many of you what will be the optimal outcome from your point of view from the Paris negotiations. Now I would like to ask what is the most realistic or the most possible outcome that you see and how it compares to your goals that you presented. For instance, the Commission has presented a long-term goal of 50% reduction by 2050. And the second question would be, what are the tricky issues that needs to be solved before we can get a global climate deal? Please put on your microphones because you will need them. And who would like to start? Shall we take the same order? Thomas?
Thanks for the two questions. I'll try not to repeat what has already been said and add to the discussion. So what do I think is a likely outcome? I would say that it is likely that all of the elements that have been put on the table in the discussion today are reflected in the agreement. I think we will get an agreement in the end, and I think it will be, as was highlighted by many speakers, an international legally binding agreement with a long-term objective, some kind of mechanism for revision, and provisions for increased transparency and accountability among all countries. The key question for me is the level of precision that we are able to give to these elements. So let us take, for example, the question of regular revision of our targets, which many speakers mentioned. We could think of a system in which it's very clear that every country will come back to the table every 5 years to propose a new emission reduction contribution after we've had a chance to look at progress that has been made, and with a view to increasing ambition towards the 2 degrees target. That would be a kind of optimal solution for this issue of regular revision. On the other hand, we could have a slightly more vague reflection of this principle. For example, we could say that we will take stock of the implementation of the agreement in 2018 and decide whether we need to take further action, and this would be understood as setting up another round of negotiations to build on the agreement, for example, by 2020. But we wouldn't say automatically that every country will come back every 5 years. So I think the devil is in the detail, as they always say. I think we will have a broad reflection of almost all the elements that were mentioned today in the agreement, but the key issue is with what degree of precision and with what degree of clarity. I also spoke a little bit about the key issues, and these were also reflected by many speakers. There is the issue of finance and the issue of differentiation, so maybe I would just allow myself to go into a little more detail on these two issues. If we take the issue of differentiation, it was mentioned by many that the world has evolved a lot. So you have China with per capita GDP of just under 5,000 US dollars per year at market exchange rates, and you have countries like Saudi Arabia or Singapore or South Korea or Mexico, which are also, according to the Climate Change Convention, defined as developing countries. And then you have the least developed countries with GDP of less than 1,000 US dollars per year. And a country like India, which is a big country, but has GDP of about 1,500 US dollars per year, and emissions of 1.5 tons per capita. So there is a huge spectrum of countries within the group of countries that traditionally we have called developing countries. It does not seem possible to me that we would define a new group of countries or new groupings of countries. For example, developed, emerging and developing countries. That doesn't seem to me to be politically feasible, nor does it seem to me to be particularly desirable, because history has shown that when you try and define groups of countries, that tends to make the regime more rigid. It's difficult then to redefine those countries, etc., etc. So we are looking to create a regime in which all countries are required to participate, and in which all countries define their level of participation according to their national circumstances, but guided by common principles and common rules. Let me take the example of the INDCs, these intended nationally determined contributions, which are the backbone of the agreement. We said in 2013 that all countries should propose a national contribution. We defined basic rules for the transparency and credibility of these contributions in 2014. But we never said that developed countries must do X, emerging countries must do Y, and least developed countries must do Z. We gave countries space to self-differentiate. And we've seen that indeed countries seem to have put themselves in broad groups of countries. Developed countries have taken absolute reductions, emerging countries have taken relative reductions per unit GDP, and sectoral policy commitments like a non-fossil fuel target in the case of China. and least developed countries have done more qualitative contributions. So this system of self-differentiation within the space of common rules, common procedures, and a commitment to participate seems to work quite well. And this is, I imagine, the way that we will approach the issue of differentiation. There will be, for example, a general requirement on all countries to participate in a stronger transparency regime. And we will probably negotiate a regime that allows countries to self-differentiate within that common framework regarding transparency and accountability, but all countries will be part of a single framework and all will be accountable. Getting there will be very difficult, I think. There are countries who, for ideological reasons, are more opposed to the evolution of the climate regime in this direction. And there are countries like India which are deeply concerned about their development trajectory and so on. So it won't be easy, but this is the kind of agreement that I think we will try and fashion. And it will be a new kind of agreement based on universal participation, common rules and procedures, but a high degree of self-differentiation. So that would be one area, and I've tried to outline a little bit more where the solution could be. I don't want to take up any more time, so maybe other colleagues would go further on the issue of finance or something like that.
Maybe I can pick up from here, since I can build my contribution essentially what has been said by Thomas. I wouldn't have a different answer in terms of what would be the building components in the agreement shaping up in Paris. What I would like to say maybe is how political it is that, how important it is that we have this translation of the political will and global engagement and embracement of the need for action, how important it is that this translates into the legal text eventually, because I think we still have some work to do there. We have no reason to believe that we are not going to have a good agreement from Paris, because we hear that there is a lot of goodwill around the world, but we know that will be quite a lot of work for negotiators still to come to the concrete legal text around all these key elements. I would also share that the view that differentiation, well, I would still say also the legal form and force of the agreement, and then financial support are going to be critical elements in shaping up that process. If you look at the differentiation issues, this is very complex, but I think it was so well explained by Thomas that I don't need to dive more into it. Just saying that, you know, it may be that different solutions may apply in different areas. So I think that is more differentiation as said. And then also what I think we may see coming out is that eventually countries will realize that if they, not only developed countries are those who would finance this huge and tremendous transformation of the economies. I think there is a sharing understanding building up that the group of countries that would be behind that effort would need to grow in the Paris Agreement. We can see positive signs from China and other emerging economies. This is very critical. In relation to the adaptations and to the impacts of climate change, I think we would need to have an open mind there, because this is critical for many developing countries and small islands to see that reassurance in the agreement. Maybe I will just come back to the last intervention, because if I may take this opportunity, because I think it's very interesting also to have an industry perspective as a contributor to our discussion today, because as it was said, it is very important that we have in mind that these global commitments eventually would materialize in policy and measures at the national level. And the European Union, you would remember, had in 2014, October 2014, the decision on the highest level, on the level of states, heads of states and governments, that we have a binding commitment for at least minus 40% domestic economy-wide target. This, I think, is very important for the European Union to continue to play its leadership role. There are already, well, we have already the proposal on the revision of the EU ETS, EU emission trading system, and it was already commented also throughout the presentation, which is going to set the target and the ways how to achieve the reduction in the energy-intensive industries and power sector. Well, I think it's very important that we, of course, would like to have a perfect agreement out of Paris. But maybe, as Thomas said, we cannot have everything at the perfectionist level. So already when designing the EU ETS revision proposal that was presented in July, we did it with a mind of following the heads of states and governments steering, which said that Europe will continue with the free allocation until the major economies are going to take a comparative effort in climate. Vision is designed around that, a key steering element that came from the European Council. Of course, you know, we need to see what Paris brings, but I just want to say that so far the European climate policy was incentivizing industry to go for more innovation, to go for new solutions, low carbon solutions. And we are critically supporting your last statement that Europe, it is essential that steel is made in Europe. Clearly, I think this is a very important message and I fully endorse it. But I would like to add to this, I think it is in the interest of the European Union, European industry to be advanced and have solutions for the future. If you listen to our partners from the US, our partners from China, I think it's very important that European industry remains competitive as it is today and finds this competitive advantage also in the low carbon technologies. For that reasons, we have proposed within this EU emission trading system revision also the Innovation Fund, which will help European industry to go through this transition period and support the breakthrough technologies. I would like to stress that, you know, one of the requests that was also put on the paper that the European industry or the industry would need to be part of that support from the Innovation Fund. The proposal is, of course, you know, bringing that forward. And I do hope that we are going to find also very good projects to support it. It is intended to support the projects in the demonstration scale. And so far, not so much of supporting funds were given at that stage of the development of the new technologies. Just in short, that I would like to say again, as I stressed at the beginning, it is the European leadership that created a lot of positive incentives around the globe. It is our domestic policies that are convincing that it is possible to grow and at the same time reduce emissions. So I would stop here for my first intervention.
Thank you. Once again, you didn't give me any chance to disagree. I do agree with your comments, Mary and Thomas, very much. Maybe I might raise a somewhat more basic point as well on the how to accompany the process pre-Paris and also post-Paris. What's going to happen after Paris? And I think we must realize there might be some opponents around who would love to criticize Paris on a simple basis by saying, okay, we have certain problems. The ETS maybe not in a very
good shape. Did we manage to radically reform the ETS? No, we did not. Did we manage to get a super firm agreement on emissions reductions, etc.? No, we did not. So Paris failed. Paris is a complete failure. We have to prevent this. And how can we prevent it? Simply by more information, I guess. So we have to work with the public audience, with the media, with university, with the general audience. I think there's a lot of work to be done on that to get more information across and to make people see that Paris, in the end, will be not the end of a long process, but it's rather a major step forward, leading to an even better development on combating climate change. So that's as a very general remark. As Thomas said, there will be varying levels of precisions in the agreement that we can look at, so we have to wait for that. We discussed the 2 degrees. Maybe we didn't mention that 1.5 degrees was also discussed. It's a point put forward by the AOSIS, the smaller countries, so they have an interest in limiting the climate change even further. So that's another aspect, but I should leave it here and pass on to the next speakers. Thank you.
Somebody else?
Yes, thank you again. So first of all, we have big hopes that we arrive at a decent, legally binding agreement, because then it's going to be for the Slovak presidency to carry on next year in Morocco, Marrakesh. So we all hope that we will arrive at an agreement, and God bless, the agreement will be signed and agreed. I think the global political momentum we are now witnessing, it has never been such mobilization worldwide. I mean, we talked a little bit about the Copenhagen Accord in 2009. There was also a big mobilization, but perhaps it was not smart enough. I think also the parties to the UNFCCC did not really committed themselves, as it is the case for the time being, and it is also a promising, let's say, step ahead. Second issue is the ownership. I mentioned already in my first introduction that ownership of the commitments via so-called INDCs is the key, and of course, having let's say a broader picture, EU has the lead, and EU is putting very ambitious targets on the table. I mean, if I would definitely concur with the panelists who spoke before me, but nevertheless, for Slovakia, it will be a big challenge to meet those targets, even in the ETS, as it was mentioned, but especially for the sectors outside trading scheme. That will be tremendously challenging, having in mind, let's say, the increase of emissions in transport sector, for example. So we have to be ambitious, but at the same time realistic, and we think that the ownership is the key. And maybe last point is the financing. We have to be very clear on this, that without further, let's say, commitments and further reassurances, especially to the LDCs or to developing countries, we won't get to an agreement. And as I said, it is a critical component. We need also other emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, and others to play their part and to share, this burden. Although understanding where our starting point, and also having in mind the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. But without further reassurances on financing, I don't think that we could get a final agreement done. So thank you. That's it from my side.
Mr. Rafi Balian?
Yes, so much of what I wanted to say has been said already, so I will just, it's very easy to, I think for the United States, the conversation is important in Paris, but the work really begins after Paris, and that's the critical point to make, is that Paris is not the conclusion. Paris is just a step and really a beginning of the conversation in terms of the transformation that we're discussing. In terms of the issues, the challenges, the legal nature, I think, has been discussed several times. I think what Mary Veronica had presented in her initial presentation about looking at how we make the the submission of the commitments every 5 years. There's a process of accountability and transparency, and looking at what countries put forward, making that a requirement as part of a broader process is absolutely in line with what we've been discussing. But looking at the commitments themselves, I think the commitments need to be done based on national circumstances and capabilities. They need to be, and this gets to the point that Norbert made about ownership. The countries need to feel that they have ownership. It has to be a bottom-up approach as much as a top-down effort in order for this to be sustainable in every sense of the word, both sustainable economically, environmentally, socially. And so that's an important point, and I agree as well in terms of the financing. But what I would add is that the financing discussion cannot just be about development assistance and the expectation by countries that they are going to receive development assistance, because there is no capacity to absorb that level of development assistance in the world. So it has to be a discussion of how we mobilize and leverage and get private sector investments into clean energy and clean technology projects around the world, particularly in developing countries. Thank you.
Mr. Yuan?
So from my opinion of the tricky issue of this agreement, I think the participate can be two parts. One is developed countries and one is developing countries. But I think, for me, I have been traveling to the whole Asia, like Vietnam, Thailand, Mongolia, Myanmar, a lot of the developing countries. I think for them, they still have no attention about the. They don't know really much about the climate change. They focus on the economic growth. I think the tricky issue should be, how to let these developing countries to notice about this and to realize how important it is. This is my opinion.
Thank you. I think the last comment is very much valid also in this country and the region. And the last comment by Mr. Kiraľvarga, please.
Thank you very much. Couple of facts, and I hope that I'll be correct and my numbers are right. EU companies, EU industries would like to be competitive and would like to remain competitive. And competitive means that we have a comparable cost to produce our products, which we used to say ground level playing. But we all know that we pay double price for energy here in European Union over the price of the energy, the electricity in States, for example. And if we look over the additional cost which is coming, as Mary mentioned, that free allocation, yes, but not for everybody. It used to be for everybody, but not for everybody in the future. So for those who will not get 100% free allocation, it will cost them money, which is additional cost for their production. On the other side, we can say, well, we can install a new technology, it costs the money. Even the fund available, even loans are available, the capital investment costs the money. And if we decided do not spend the money, and rather than then decrease the production, we can decrease the emission, even below 9% of the global emissions. But on the other hand, our market, home market, EU markets, will be filled by somebody else importing the products. So somewhere else, the emission will go up. So is this the situation we wanted to achieve from the global perspective? I don't think so. So I think that everything what has been said, I can agree, again, legally binding agreement and everything, but we need to look pragmatically what will happen, as it was mentioned that real work will start after the COP21. What will happen if legal binding agreement, and what kind of legal binding agreement will be achieved, and if not? Thank you.
So thank you for all the reactions. Now it's time for your questions. I see one over there. Please introduce yourself before putting the question.
Good afternoon. Is it on? Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Lukáš Pataki. I work as energy consultant in Schneider Electric. I have one question to Mrs. from the Commission and Mr. from the US, and it's regarding the emission scheme. So we saw as a direct result of the Kyoto in the 90s that the EU imposed the EU ETS scheme mechanism, basically limiting the emissions based on the quotas from the EU, but it was a result of the Kyoto more or less. Now we suspect that probably after the Paris, US might also copy this kind of mechanism and basically start to impose a US mechanism on the emission scheme allocation, because now it happened already in California, if I'm not mistaken. And now we see that the EU and US are closing the TIP, which means more cooperation in the economy. Do you think there is a likelihood that in the future there's going to be a merged allocation of the emissions between US and EU? Thank you.
Veronica?
Okay. Linked trading between US and EU.
Okay, I will take it if I understood you right. If I did not, you may come back with follow-up question. But I think it's very important that the global that we have a global agreement and robust and binding global agreement, and I think that's certainly what we are aiming at. With now this situation that several governments, beyond 160 governments, committed themselves for following up, with an action on national level, is an important, I think, first step. But of course, we need to see how that will translate into policy and measures at home. Now, Europe has in place the emission trading system since 10 years, but this is not the only policy that we have in the European Union. You would be surely aware that this policy is complemented by the policies in the transport, in the cars industry, standards for cars. We have also followed up the Montreal Protocol implementation, and there are other actions that are part of European Union policy tool, if you want. And we are going to work also on this broad policy toolbox after Paris. So it will be EU ETS, which covers power sector and energy-intensive industries, and it will be also a complementary part, it was mentioned by Norbert, that will cover other sectors, particularly, efficiency of buildings, transport sector, agriculture, and these are also important actions that are taken at the European level. Now, your question more specifically relates to carbon markets, if I understood it well. I would like to say that, as it was, presented by Raffia, US has taken already a very important action at domestic level. I mean, we have seen important initiatives taking place last summer and now translating into concrete laws, but there are also already functioning emission trading systems at the state level. For example, in California, a very important carbon market has been developed, and also in other US states. So maybe, US will have a different composition of actions, not necessarily everything, not necessarily soon, the carbon market, but I think what is essential that we are reaching out with the same ambition to transform the economies towards low carbon. One important movement which I would like to share with you, and I'm sure maybe our Chinese colleague can tell us more about that, but I can tell you out of my own experience, and that is that China announced their commitment to put in place the national emission trading system from 2017 on. Currently, as you would know, China is running 7 pilot projects, and the European Union has a very intensive cooperation with Chinese authorities to assist them in their preparations of the domestic nationwide system. I think this is a very important policy move from China also, because as we know, China in terms of pollution, greenhouse gas emissions is getting its key importance if we want to be successful. So for us, this is an important regional market that is building up. Now, in terms of linking, I would like to say we need time for that. Where European Union is putting an effort now is to conclude a linking agreement with Switzerland. But this is a very similar jurisdiction with very similar, goals, with very similar ambition. But be reassured that it is a very, very difficult negotiation because you need to go through a lot of, parameters, design elements, a lot of nitty-gritty technical stuff, if you want, but very important to preserve the level playing field, to preserve the ambition. And from that experience, I can tell you that, of course, the Europe would confirm that, we would see linking, emerging markets around the globe one day. But for me, we need to take this steadily, gradually, and see how regional or national markets mature. And for me, it is very, very important to say that a lot of governments in their INDCs or national pledges put forward carbon pricing, either carbon market or taxation, as one of the ways to implement their national policies. Maybe I will stop here.
Mr. Raffia, Balian would like to react?
So I think, thank you for your question. I think it's important to understand that different countries have different systems, and you cannot apply your own understanding of the way things operate, for example, in the European Union to how things would operate, for example, in the United States. So I think it's important that, as was mentioned, recently I had the opportunity to speak with the chairperson of the California Air Resources Board, which is actually older than the Environmental Protection Agency. It was founded in California before the Environmental Protection Agency was created in the 70s. And the chairperson is a very prominent individual in the United States on environmental issues. And as she visited us in Budapest, and she was indicating exactly the issue of the market that California is now developing, and they are in discussions with several Canadian provinces as well to expand the market. And as I mentioned in my presentation, New York and the New England states and some of the Mid-Atlantic states are also in conversations with several Canadian provinces. So for us, the regulatory framework for utilities in the United States is done at the state level. So the federal government role is not as significant or important. So it's important to understand that if states are taking action in the United States, it means work is being done. Often people confuse because the federal government hasn't taken action on a particular issue that the United States is not moving forward. That's actually incorrect. Because states have the authority, because we very much believe in the concept of subsidiarity, which is the founding principle of the Treaty of Rome. So we feel that if states have the authority, and they do for utility regulation, then they need to take the action, and certain states are. Now, it's a significant amount of states. California is the 8th largest economy in the world. So, and New York is not very far behind. So you have a significant action on the two coasts that are taking place. And in many ways, this will be an example for us as we move forward. In addition, what we are doing is through ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the Maritime Organization, the United States is working very actively to improve the fuels and the emissions, to decrease and reduce the emissions from aviation fuel, shipping fuel, and we're investing billions of dollars in research and new technologies and developing alternatives. So much work is being done right now in the United States to shift away from the major pollutants that are causing the significant issue that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? Please in the front.
Thank you very much. Josef Badida, energy analyst here from Slovakia. I was listening very carefully, and Mr. Kiraľvarga was quite critical on carbon leakage and also on carbon allowances. But according to our law, I know that Mr. Kurila could confirm probably that that revenues coming from carbon allowances sold on the market are returning back to the economy to support energy efficiency projects. So the question is whether you, as a representative of the economy of the business, you don't have a really contact with this kind of money, or what does it mean in practical life? That if you want to invest in any kind of energy efficiency, can you get back money from a state coming from this carbon allowances? How is it really in practical? Thank you.
Poviem trošku po slovensky. Som z Asociácie pre využitie obnoviteľných alternatívnych zdrojov a mám otázku na panelistov.
I have a question for the panelists. Several of you I know in person. First of all, Noro, how do you envision the ambitiousness of Slovakia during the presidency in the EU, and at the same time the ambitions of the People's Republic of China to invest its money into new economy and thus reduce emissions, and simultaneously assistance of the People's Republic of China to support improvement of the environment? And the question or comment for the US, how can you envision co-investing, for example, risk venture capital in the sphere of and there we need to be looking for synergy effects. And now the question for China: why China has selected CEE region as a region for further cooperation? How do you envision the Green Silk Road concept? Thank you very much.
Please, the microphone here.
Hi, my name is Ellen Scholl, and I'm a visiting Bosch Fellow working in Berlin focused on energy security. And I guess I have two general but related questions about the U.S. role in negotiations. The first is sort of to all of the panelists who wish to answer, and the second one perhaps is a bit more directed to Mr. Balian. The first one would be what the sort of European response was, if any, to Secretary Kerry's comments a few weeks ago that the treaty, if anything, would not be legally binding, given the degree to which I think most of the panelists have mentioned that one particular characteristic. And I think the second question would be, given that you mentioned that state-level action and work beginning at home being two important components of sort of the American participation in this process, when you think about sort of the legal challenges that have been mounted to the Clean Power Plan in the United States, which of course underpins the domestic INDC, sort of how does this relate to the process when we think about how countries must actually implement their INDCs after the process? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Who would like to start from the panel? Norbert.
Thank you. Maybe I will touch a little bit the first question and then we'll come back to the second question. Yes, it's very true. We have to know that, as was already said, we are now entering, or we are now in the third phase of the emission trading scheme, and the fourth one is being now negotiated for post-2020. The auctioning system as such is a new feature which is actually in place as of 2013 and is the principle how to distribute the allowances for the installations that are in the emission trading scheme, so as to the industry and the power generator. This option of recycling of revenues stems also from the European directive on emission trading scheme, where you have recommendations or indications that about 50% of the revenues should be back recycled into the system. And this is also actually applied in the Slovak Act, where we want to redistribute those revenues back to the industry. There are actually 4 areas how those revenues are redistributed further. So this is just to underscore that it's also, this example is kind of a new feature that also the Slovak authorities are trying to implement. And of course it would be very advisable if the industry make benefits of it. Regarding the second question for the Slovak presidency and the Chinese cooperation, so firstly I would speak about the Slovak presidency and the priorities maybe, and then we can maybe make a link to the possible investments. As you know, the EU agenda is very much set. It's like a rolling stone. It's something that each and respective country cannot really change dramatically. So I would say that 80 to 90% of the agenda is already given. So for Slovakia itself, we have a very limited room for maneuvering and very limited area of pushing the national interests. In terms of the priorities, we set out 4 priorities. Also, we're working in the trio context, so we work closely with Netherlands, who are taking the presidency as of January 2016, and then the Maltese colleagues who are taking the presidency as of January 2017. And for the Slovak part, we will have as of July 16 till December 16. So we will tackle definitely the climate change, and we will do the post-Paris aftermath, concentrating on especially on the implementing decisions that there are more of technical nature, and there need to be fine-tuned and actually negotiated. So after Paris will be one of the areas. Second is the domestic legislation in the climate field, in the climate action area, and we talked about the review of the emission trading scheme. We have talked about the non-ETS dimensions, so the sectors that are outside the trading scheme. We will talk during the presidency about how better decarbonize our transport sectors, and even broadening the non-ETS system with the area like agricultural, land use and forestry. This is something new that needs to be fit in the European legislation. This is the number one, the climate. Second issue is the circular economy. Circular economy is a concept where we go from the traditional linear type of economy to more circular one, to more closing the gap one. And we will do quite a lot on the waste legislation. We will have to manage the process of amending six pieces of waste legislation on top of the overall circular economy concept. Third issue will be biodiversity and nature protection. That is actually also quite important, even for Slovakia, having 40% or nearly 40% of its territory as a natural reserve. So this land, this territory is basically preserved and conserved. And last but not least, it's the water, the area of water use and integrated water management. So these 4 priorities, I was speaking on behalf of the Minister of Environment, are the 4, let's say, guiding areas where we would push ahead the work, and we will try to advance or even close the negotiations. And maybe direct a link to the Chinese friends. Of course, we are very open to cooperate with any actors and any even businesses or association or even public administration that are willing to promote let's say the better environmental services and provide let's say a framework for further cooperation. So I think we would stand open for any kind of cooperation that is mutually beneficial, and it's in the line, let's say, with the EU acquis as such, and also the Slovak priorities. Of course, I would need to know more details, what exactly you have in mind, but in principle, we could be very open to any collaboration and cooperation.
Okay, so there were still 2 or 3 questions to be answered. We have 5 minutes, and Alexander told me that we need to finish on time, so please be brief and concise in your responses. Maybe, Thomas, you can respond to the question here.
So I will take the question regarding the legal form of the agreement and the position of the United States there. First of all, I think that Secretary Kerry was misquoted in the interview that happened in the Financial Times. I don't think that the US position has changed at all from what it was aiming for, which is an internationally legally binding agreement with some non-binding provisions. I think there is another issue, namely that the United States would probably prefer not to call the agreement a treaty or a protocol. For domestic political reasons, we can call it whatever we want, it doesn't matter. For me, the main legal issue relates to the legal obligation vis-à-vis the national contributions. Here, the European Union has traditionally said that we would like those national contributions to be legally binding. This raises problems for the United States because it would like the contributions to be binding in procedural terms, but not in terms of their achievement. So for the US to ratify the agreement, President Obama needs to be able to say to Congress, we can implement this under existing regulation and existing legislation. In nowhere in the US legislation does it say that the US will achieve 26 to 28%. It's a piece-by-piece approach from different regulations that they want to achieve this target. So for that reason, it would be very difficult for Obama to say that he could agree to minus 26 to minus 28% in a legally binding outcome under the authority which he has as president. I think that the European Union sees some margin for maneuver on this point. For me, the most important thing is that there are binding procedures to which all countries are submitted, for them to be transparent about their contributions, for them to participate in this revision mechanism, and for them to implement their contributions. And I would take note of the fact that in the Environment Council conclusions from September this year, the Environment Ministers said that the Paris Agreement should provide for the transparency, revision and implementation of contributions, which is not so far away from where the US is standing on this. So I think the Financial Times was not being particularly good journalists when they took Secretary of State Kerry's remarks.
Mr. Balian, is there
Yes.
still something you
Yes.
would like to compliment
Absolutely.
from the US
Absolutely.
perspective?
No, absolutely. I would like to comment on this. I think it's important to understand that the United States is not the only country that is concerned about the legal nature of this agreement. There are many other countries who are also concerned, and I think it's important to understand that if there are significant emitters who would walk away if the provision is that every aspect of this agreement is legally binding.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's understand that we're not just talking about the United States right now. We're talking about a significant number of other countries. And the other concern we have with the legally binding issue is if we make implementation of commitments legally binding, what level of ambition are we going to have? Because countries are going to come to the table with the absolute least possible things they can do, which they probably have already done. So there will be no ambition in the agreement because they know that they've already finished and complied with the agreement. So we will never reach the 2-degree goal, long-term goal. And so I think it's important to understand we would rather have ambition and have countries commit, own, and transform their economies. In terms of your second question, the way I would explain it is this. Every significant change, every significant development in the United States that has fundamentally shifted society has been challenged legally throughout the course of American history. There has been not one single change in America that has not been challenged in our courts. And in many ways, we welcome the challenge in our legal system because it allows us to make things better, to improve them and to implement them in a way that brings everyone in society together. So we expected the challenges in the court, and they will continue. The important element of what the Supreme Court ruled on the Clean Power Plan was that the Environmental Protection Agency has the legal authority to regulate carbon pollution as a detriment to health and well-being of American citizens. The process by which they are doing it, in terms of taking into account the impact on businesses, that's the element that they need to modify, which the lawyers right now working in the Environmental Protection Agency, along with lawyers across all the federal government agencies, are currently working through those issues and are going to make the law even better. So there's no reason to question why it's being legally challenged. Every change in America has been legally challenged, and it will do so because we are a litigious society. Thank you.
Somebody else who would like to react on the last round of questions, please.
I assume my question was why China choose CEE as the developer of the Green Silk Road. My answer is, I think I will answer from the two ways. One is the political ways, another one is from the economic side. So in China, all of us know, China, the political is stronger than the economy. When China have a national strategy, government want to develop the Silk Road and everybody follows. So that's quite different to Europe. And we also have the 1+16 conference, and which hosts year by year, and I think it is quite good. And also from the provincial government, we are promoting this cooperation, the Green Silk Road with the CE countries. I have been led more than 10 government delegation to Slovakia and Hungary. They all come here for develop this Green Silk Road. So from the economic side, I think there are a lot of the opportunities between CE and China. From my experience, I have been involved in negotiate about some of the projects like bridge, road, railway station, and energy, like a power plant. I think the CE companies desire the investment from China, and the China part is willing to cooperate. So I think it could be a very good collaboration with China and the CE. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our time allocation and our discussion today. I would like to thank all our panelists, Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Tovšak Pleterski, Mr. Balian, Mr. Kiraľvarga, Mr. Meister, Mr. Kurila, and Mr. Yuan. Maybe a short applause would us. Thanks. Many thanks also for your active participation and interest. At the end, I would like to wish all the success to negotiators in Paris to reach a global agreement on the global problem of the climate change that will benefit citizens and businesses. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you. Let me extend also my thanks to all panelists for a very interesting panel. It was a Paris conference in a smaller format a bit, but it was really very interesting and informative. I have just 3 technical announcements. The first one, please look at the banners where you can find information where the dinner sessions will be taking place. I mean, this is the dinner session for which you registered. Second one, let me misuse my position of being the organizer because we all need a bit sort of refreshment, 30 minutes. The dinner sessions will start 6:15, so 30 minutes. And the third is a rather recommendation because the meals and drinks are already served. I would like to encourage, especially the speakers at the dinner sessions, to start eating immediately, to have more time to focus on the session than on the dinner during the dinner session. So, thank you very much, and now 30 minutes break.